an evaluation form after grand rounds. So I'm Dr. Skatsina, and I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Erin Majchrzak today, who will be our presenter. Her presentation is called Saving Lives, One Vaccine at a Time, so a very important and timely topic. Dr. Majchrzak is, of course, one of our senior pediatric residents and superstars. She completed her medical school training at the Kirksville College of Osteopathic Medicine. She will be graduating at the end of this semester, and like I said, she's really been one of our superstars in residency, has provided leadership in a lot of areas, including the sim lab. She's been a sim lab instructor for medical students. She helped with asthma guideline implementation and quality improvement. She's been a leader for several of our health promotion and community advocacy initiatives, and has incorporated some of her background in the performing arts to address child abuse prevention and health promotion. She's done several presentations for the department and at the Appalachian Student Research Forum on a range of different topics and case presentations. So we are thrilled that she's graduating, but we're sad that she's leaving us. She is going to be joining an outpatient practice in Marion, Virginia, Mountain View Pediatrics. So thank you so much for presenting, and I'll give you the mic.
Thank you, Dr. Skatsina. So as Dr. Skatsina said, my presentation is about vaccines, which, as we all know, is a rather controversial topic, has been for the last 10 to 15 years, and we'll get into some of the history of that as we go through. But please enjoy, and I'll hopefully have some time for questions at the end, but if you need any clarifications while we're working our way through, please feel free to ask. Of course, I have my disclosure slide. I don't have any financial interest or arrangements for this presentation. And today, we are going to look at the current vaccination schedule. Hopefully, all of you remember most of the vaccination schedules, but there's been several updates this year we'll talk about. We're going to talk about some side effects and contraindications, and then look at the myths of vaccines, which of course we all know are things that parents bring to us, and then some ways that we can talk to parents about vaccines. So this schedule, which is hard to see on one slide, is the newest 2017 hot-off-the-press vaccine schedule. And it really doesn't have too many terrible changes. It's familiar, hopefully, to everybody from our older attendings to our newer attendings to our residents. And we get a copy of this each year. It's updated by the CDC. There also is a schedule for catch-up immunizations, so for any patients that may have missed immunizations or moved and not had the correct immunizations. And again, these are things that we should hopefully all know as pediatricians, so I'm not going to go into terribly much detail. The newest chart that was added this year was a vaccines by certain disease chart. So we all know there are certain disorders and diseases that we have to avoid vaccinations in. So the vaccines are listed on, when you're looking at it, the left-hand side. And across the top are varying pregnancy, diseases. So it has everything from HIV, immunocompromised states, to kidney failure, heart disease, cochlear implants. So things you might see commonly in pediatrics. The yellow which is what you see on most of them, is vaccinate according to schedule. The yellow with the black dots on it is vaccines are recommended, but they may actually need an additional dose of the vaccine. And there's a couple other colors on there. Purple, or the lilac color, is recommended if there's a risk factor for indications. So the biggest one is for the MenB, which is the new meningococcal vaccine. Red is contraindicated, which is typically the live viruses. And then orange, which you don't see much on there, is vaccinate with precautions. That's like the rotavirus for immunocompromised states, except for still SCID is a no-no for rotavirus. So this chart came out with the new package of charts that you'll get for regular schedule, catch-up schedule, and now certain disease schedule. Does anybody know or want to take a guess as to, by the time a child born today, February 22nd, and we've had a couple already this morning, if they get all of their vaccines from now until they graduate high school, how many vaccines they're going to get? Somebody throw a number out. 25. Any other higher or lower?
54.
All right, we got a 25 and a 54. And actually, I don't know who said 54 over there, but it's 55 vaccines. So congratulations. I wish I had a prize for you. So the standard schedule of vaccines is 36 shots from birth to the end of high school. And 19 of those shots are flu vaccines. And of course, you get 2 in your first year of life if vaccinated accordingly. So I just thought that was an interesting factoid. There's actually a really nice tool on the CDC's website. It's an immunization calculator. So you can type in the child's date and then print off a whole schedule for the parents that'll say, on this date they should get these vaccines, on this date they should get these vaccines. And it's either a little daunting or a little cool depending on how you look at it. So here's some updates for everybody. So the biggest change to the hepatitis B vaccine was that now we're recommending all newborns get the hepatitis B vaccine. It used to be that anybody less than 2,000 grams and anybody unstable was considered out of the recommendation for the vaccine. However, now we're recommending everybody, and they do make the caveat instability or instability is, of course, still a contraindication. But anybody, even premature infants, should receive this vaccine. They also still mention about receiving the Hbig, so the hepatitis B immunoglobulin within 12 hours of life if mom is positive. And then they did make a caveat that you can now test for the antibody at ages 9 to 12 months instead of ages 12 to 18 months. So you are okay to test a little bit younger. For the Hib vaccine, the Comvax, which was the original Hib vaccine that was created, is no longer commercially available, so it's being taken out of the schedule and you won't find it in your footnotes anymore. But Hiberix, which is one of the newer variations of the Hib, is on the list now that you can use as a primary vaccine. PCV7 is no longer available commercially as well. Everybody who's had PCV7, it's phased out at this point. We're now recommending the PCV13. So that has been removed from the footnotes as well. And as hopefully everybody remembers, a few months ago they came out with the documentation and the evidence that the live attenuated influenza vaccine, the nose spray, which of course was wonderful for pediatrics, wasn't as effective as we had thought it was, so they've taken that out from the option for a flu vaccine. We now have 2 different meningitis vaccines. The meningitis ACWY, which vaccinates for the ACWY variants of the meningococcal bacteria. We recommend that HIV children now have those as well, as long as their counts are greater than 15,000. And for the MenB, they've added it in that it's just on clinical discretion. So if you think the child is or teenager is in a high-risk school or high-risk job that might need the MenB, it's a 2-dose schedule that they're recommending. The tetanus, we are now changing the preference for pregnant women. They want it done as early as possible, starting at 27 weeks, so all pregnant women should receive a tetanus or Tdap vaccine. And children who are getting catch-up tetanus vaccines can have either the Tdap or the TD for their adolescent dose. It used to be just the Tdap was what was recommended. And finally, HPV, so there were 8 vaccines altogether that had changes made to them. This is an exciting thing for our teenage boys and girls that we now only recommend 2 doses of the HPV vaccine before their 15th birthday. Unfortunately, if they start late or if they're immunocompromised, we still recommend those 3 doses. And the 2 doses should be 4 months apart, but we recommend ideally 6 months apart, either or. So, what kinds of things do we need to look out for in vaccines, and what kinds of things should we tell parents to watch out for? The biggest thing, and what they say for a relative contraindication for vaccines, is that severe illness is still something that you need to avoid vaccines. So that's high fevers, influenza, if you're really sick, if you're in the ICU or heading to the ER to potentially go to the ICU, we're not going to vaccinate those kids. But in general, there are very few contraindications to vaccines. So I'm going to go through a couple of the specifics that everybody should be aware of. Hepatitis B, and this is actually the same. I put this in there once rather than 16 times for all the different vaccines. A severe allergic reaction, so a documented anaphylaxis to a previous dose or any of the vaccine components, is an absolute contraindication to vaccination. But those are so few and far between, and the data, there's so few numbers of actual anaphylaxis events. They have to put it on there because obviously it's a contraindication, but for parents' sakes, if they ask about it, you can say that the numbers are very small. Rotavirus, the SCID or severe combined immunodeficiency, is a absolute contraindication for rotavirus because it's live and it goes right to the GI tract. And a history of intussusception, this is kind of a debatable point, but right now it is still a contraindication. And then for other babies who have other immunocompetencies, it's kind of as in that gray zone. So that was one of the orange colors on that first chart where you can just kind of use your clinical judgment. If you think the baby is at a high risk for rotavirus, it's probably benefits higher than risks for the vaccine. But if you're worried baby's very sick, you can just hold off on it. And for DTaP, it's the pertussis component that's the big contraindication. Anybody that's had a documented case of encephalopathy, not attributable to other causes, so no other neuro issues, brain bleeds, meningitis, encephalitis, so on and so forth, that is considered a contraindication. And for the DTaP, not the TDAP, they have listed as a relative contraindication temperature greater than 105 or higher within 48 hours of previous dose, collapse or shock-like state within 48 hours of previous dose. So those are things that can be considered relative contraindications. Hib, the only contraindication is age less than 6 weeks. MMR and varicella, being the live vaccines, are just the contraindication of known severe immunodeficiency because the immune system just can't handle those live vaccines. And pregnancy is a contraindication for those live vaccines as well. Now, if parents ask or if you're just curious about how we ensure vaccine safety, there's lots of steps for a vaccine to be developed, and I've got a nice slide after this one when I talk a little bit about it for you to kind of see the image. Vaccine development, it starts in the lab. There is animal testing that takes place during vaccine development before human testing, but it's a very long, drawn-out process with many, many steps. The clinical trials goes through 3 phases. The first phase is 20 to 100-ish healthy volunteers, and we look for side effects. If everything's safe in phase 1, we move to phase 2, which is several hundred persons at that point, and it's looking for, rather than the long-term side effects, the short-term side effects, and the immune response in this case. And then if we get through that step, we move to step 3, which is thousands of people, and compares those that are vaccinated to those that are not vaccinated for immune response and effectiveness. So those are the 3 steps of the clinical trials. The VAERS, or the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, is a national FDA monitored system that is through the internet now, monitored daily. Any healthcare provider, so nurses, doctors, nurse practitioners, can submit any adverse event to a vaccine. For example, we actually had a patient admitted several months ago with pneumonia, and the only thing we could link it to was her flu vaccine. So we submitted it to the VAERS. I haven't seen the final result from that yet, if they considered it an adverse event or not, but we did it just to be thorough in our case. Parents can actually submit to the VAERS as well, so you can let them know if they're concerned, they can submit. The Vaccine Safety Data Link works with the numbers in VAERS to help determine if the side effects reported are actually related to the vaccine. And then the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices is actually a group of medical and public health experts, and they're the ones that develop the recommendations that we use for vaccines and how we use the vaccines to control diseases in specifically the United States. They consider for each vaccine we are giving on a yearly basis safety and effectiveness, severity of disease, number of children who get the disease if there's no vaccine, and how well the vaccine works in all those at different ages. So they have a lot of work that they do. So here's kind of a little picture, and this is from a vaccine hesitancy article from Pediatrics earlier last year that shows kind of the pathway of getting the vaccine from licensed and used. So as you can see, there's like 12 steps. So here is the bulk of what our issues are with vaccines. And as we all know, there have been a lot of issues in media, issues with some physicians believing one thing or another, some studies that have been looked at and then rescinded. some studies that have validated data or not validated data. So we're going to talk about a lot of different things. And I actually got these, there's 6 myths altogether that I'm going to talk through, and they come from the AAP of the 6 most common concerns of parents. And I arranged them so that it kind of flows nicely, but they have a really nice website that goes through all these as well. So one of the myths that many parents have is too many too soon. And as we all know, at the 2, 4, 6 month visit, we often give three shots and an oral vaccine. The 12-month visit, I like to tell parents, is the worst because they get 6 vaccines, and if they need their second flu shot, they get 7 vaccines. So a lot of parents just think it's too much. What the AAP says is that the vaccine schedule has no vaccines interferences, so it is set perfectly so that one vaccine that baby could interfere with another vaccine don't happen at the same time. The more vaccines you give, you don't change the side effect profiles. So the profiles and risks are not higher if you give 2 vaccines versus 4 vaccines. And that specifically there are only 2 vaccines that cannot be given together, cholera and yellow fever, which I have personally never ordered for anybody. I know we do have families that travel abroad, and we have a lot of international families here in Johnson City. But those are the only 2 vaccines that cannot be given together at the same time. So this is an interesting little piece of art that I found. The very first vaccine was the smallpox vaccine, and this is actually from 1870 is when it was a political cartoon at the time in 1870. And as you can see, even there's hesitancy on the mother's face. So there's a great pediatric study from about 10, 11 years ago that talks about specifically this concern that we're worried about. So in that study, they looked at the newborn's immune system and neonatal immune systems to kind of see what happens when we have all these vaccines. How many antigens are we giving to these babies? Is it too many? And they've came up with a lot of good data that really proves against that myth that we give too many vaccines at the same time. So babies actually have B cells and T cells when they're still in the fetal stage, and they're present by 14 weeks of gestation. I found that amazing that by 14 weeks there's already some of an immune system that started to develop. They are, of course, protected from maternal immunoglobulins via the placenta and maternal blood, and then the breast milk and colostrum if they're breastfed. And even at the time of birth, babies can mount an immune response to vaccines, bacteria, viruses that they may be exposed to. The infant, the neonate, can respond to these vaccines just fine. The primary series that we give, so the DTaP, Hep B, pneumonia, Hib, and polio are what we can consider the primary series now. 90% of infants who have that respond to them just fine. So when they looked at the data after these infants had the shots, their response and their immune response was just fine. So believe it or not, they say that infants can respond to an extremely large number of antigens, which I'll give you some of the numbers of how many antigens we give now in the vaccines shortly here. But that's like 10 billion different antibody specificities at one time, and we're not giving that many specificities at one time. And some parents are concerned with the fact that, well, we give these vaccines and their immune system is shut down for however long. And really, they prove that within several days, the immune system has really recovered itself just fine. And even in those few days of decreased response because it's working working for the vaccines, there's not an increased risk of infection. So if the baby was going to get a cold, they were going to get a cold. And the greater risk, what the article said in this specific kind of paragraph, is that those are not vaccinated at all. Infants and children are constantly building up an immunity towards viral and bacterial infections. So they're working against those antigens more than they're working against the vaccine antigens. So does anybody want to take a guess about how many vaccines theoretically we could give a baby at one time and their immune system would not be overloaded? These are my only 2 guessing questions, I promise. 10,000? Dr. J's got it. So what this study proved is that the amount of immune response that we give a baby when we give them the most vaccines at one time, so the 6 vaccines, uses up, and they use up in quotations, less than 0.1% of the immune system is activated. So what that tells us is that it eventually overcomes. But if you take those numbers with 10 plus vaccines, you could give a baby 10,000 shots at one time and their immune system would respond just fine. I don't recommend giving a baby 10,000 shots at one time, but it could be possible. So this chart, and this comes from this kind of big vaccine, or this big vaccine article, and this article was out not long after kind of the Wakefield scare, shows the number of vaccines that were possible by 2 years of age, number of vaccines given in the time, and then the possible number at a single visit. So as you can see, it has increased over the last 100 years. Of course, in 1900, the only vaccine was the smallpox vaccine. And this article was from not long after 2000, which at that point there were 11 vaccines, and there's, I think, 16 vaccines now that we're giving. So the most at the time in 2000 was 5. The most at the time now in 2017 is 7. And this looks at the number of proteins and polysaccharides that are contained in the vaccine, so the amount of antigens that babies are receiving. In 1900, it was just a mere 200 antigens at one time. And in 1960 and 1980, it was close to 3,000 antigens at a time that babies were exposed to. But through better processing, better developing of vaccines, we've been able to significantly decrease that number to the total of, from 10 years ago, 123 to 126 total antigens at one time. So really, if parents are worried that there's thousands and trillions of antigens coming in through these vaccines, you can give them the facts that it's really only a couple hundred. So, yes, exactly. So the next myth, an alternative schedule is safer for my baby. So, giving one vaccine at a time rather than giving all the vaccines as scheduled. So this next slide might be a little controversial, but this came from our now president, Donald Trump, from when he was on the campaign. This is from last year. And there were about 12 or 15 different tweets of his that I could pick from. So this shows how the media is really playing a part, and even now our president. And this actually I just found, I looked for anti-vaccine coalitions through Facebook, and I've got a couple other stock images through that. But this is just something to show, oh no, how many vaccines are we giving babies? The best example of an alternate schedule is Dr. Robert Sears, who published a book of his study in 2007. And he felt that vaccines should not be mandated. They should be optional. And what kind of goes against that is that throughout the entire article and then book that he's published, there's no mention of the dramatic reduction of diseases since vaccines were mandated in the 1970s. The alternative schedule, just to give you a little bit of a flavor, and I had to write it down, the children get no influenza until age 5, no hepatitis B until after 2.5 years of life, and no measles until age 3. And they receive no more than 2 vaccines at one visit, and then they get their shots at 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, 6 months, and then 7, 9, 12, 15, 18, 21, and 24 months, as well as 2 years, 2.5, 3, 3.5, 4, 5, and 6. So that's like 30 different visits right there, or 20 different visits right there. And what the AAP and data has shown is that while it is good that these babies are at least getting vaccinated, increasing the number of visits actually decreases the number of vaccines. How many times do we have no-shows and cancellations and mom's sick or other brother is sick so baby can't come in? So they end up missing all these vaccines and potentially never getting them made because they're sticking to a certain schedule. The AAP also stated in a statement on this schedule that children who've waited on the vaccines may actually then contract the diseases while they're waiting on their measles or mumps or rubella vaccine, either just from coming to the office to visit or from going to daycare and preschool. So the AAP is very much against this schedule. The Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report actually puts out each year a number of reported cases. They do this by region, so this actually includes North and South America, but you can see the numbers are real, that all these diseases, with the sake of polio, which we don't have any in the Americas, all these diseases occur. So you can tell parents, that there are data and numbers showing that measles, mumps, rubella does happen. Pertussis is probably the highest number on there. And I thought it was interesting, in 2012, there were almost 75,000 cases of pertussis. And as we all know, that can be a disease that's deadly. So just interesting data to support against this alternative schedule. The other thing that parents kind of worry about with this alternative schedule is, well, we'll stick to the schedule, but right now my baby's sick. I don't want to give the vaccines. And we did touch on this a little bit earlier. But several studies have proven against this factoid. So the big ones in the mid-1990s showed that an infant who had a URI 28 days to up to 7 days before vaccines, or even 0 days before vaccines in one of the studies, showed that there was no effect on the antibody response for the MMR. They just looked at one vaccine in specific. MMR, they used ELISA testing to see what the antibody response was, and babies that were healthy versus babies that were not healthy, the response, there was no difference between the two. So there's been 3 different studies that have shown this, and the third study I thought it was interesting. They also mentioned how there's only 55% of physicians that thought there was no increased risk of side effects from vaccines when there was illness present. So almost half of the pediatricians and family physicians that were taken the survey thought that if there was a URI, you shouldn't vaccinate. So when should we delay vaccines? Like I said earlier, the biggest concern is with children who have severe illness until the illness has resolved. And the biggest reason the AAP recommends this is so that we don't confuse symptoms from vaccines with symptoms from illness. And as we know, you can have mild fevers and kind of malaise and symptoms against vaccines. But if you're already malaise and have 104 fever, we don't want to necessarily make that worse or confuse it. So, next myth. The ingredients in vaccines harm my baby. This little friend came from Vermont Coalition for Vaccine Choice. And there were several states that had kind of a similar poster. I just picked one at random. And then this is I found this one from Facebook as well, about if you put all of these vaccine ingredients in a blender, you would be jailed. And I really liked how it rhymed, the educate before you vaccinate. And I absolutely agree you should educate before you vaccinate, but you just need to watch where your sources come from. And I'm going to talk about some of these things that they list on the poster here. So, do ingredients cause harm? That's something that we've had to look at in the last 15 years. Of course, we all know there are different types of antigens that we give vaccines. The weakened live viruses, so that's the MMR, rota, and varicella, they're too weak to cause the disease, but they're strong enough that they prompt an immune response. The inactivated vaccines, the viruses are killed. They can't even cause a mild form of the disease. Partial viruses and partial bacteria have specific parts of the dead viruses and bacteria in them to prompt the immune response. So those are the 4 main types that we see. And then the other ingredients that are in there, there's some fluids to help kind of keep everything in a form where it's well stored. There's preservatives, adjuvants, additives, residuals. So all kinds of, there are a lot of ingredients that we see. So the suspending fluids that are typically used, you can tell parents, are typically water or saline, sometimes protein fluids, so albumin-containing fluids. The preservatives and stabilizers, they help us preserve the vaccine, which is obviously what they are, and they typically are also albumin, phenols, and glycine. And then the adjuvants or enhancers, which I'll talk about some of those specifically here in a second, they help make the vaccine more effective so that it works better. A lot of parents are concerned about aluminum. I've had parents ask me about aluminum before. It is necessary to make vaccines. It helps us create a better immune response, and you can tell parents if we don't use aluminum in the vaccine, your child would likely need more vaccines of that specific type to make it as effective as it has with the aluminum in it. Aluminum has been used in vaccines for over 70 years now, over 80 years now, I guess. It's present in the environment. So babies actually typically get, in 33 ounces of formula, about the same amount of aluminum as vaccines. So if you have a baby who's formula fed, they're getting the same amount of aluminum they get in one visit every day if they're drinking that much formula. And we're exposed to it in the Earth's crust, in our food, in many preservatives that are used in food. So if you look at infants' blood, and many studies have looked at this, you see between 1 to 5 nanograms of aluminum per ml. So there is aluminum there anyway, so you're just giving them something they already have. Formaldehyde is another big one that parents bring up concerns about. It's really just left over from the vaccine production. It's used to detoxify or inactivate, so it's used to help kind of make the specific types of viruses. Formaldehyde is commonly found in our bloodstream. Its quantity in blood when compared to the quantity in vaccines is 10 times greater in blood. And babies are exposed to it in paper towels. Infants or older children, mascara has formaldehyde in it. Carpeting has formaldehyde in it. And like I said earlier, the bloodstream levels are higher. Mercury is another big one, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in one of the later myths here. But it's also been used since the 1930s. It's used to prepare influenza vaccine is the big one that mercury was used in. And now they're using it still to help produce the Thimerosal is the most common preservative. They use it to produce the flu vaccine, and now they take it out at the very end. So it helps make the vaccine, and then it's taken out, so it's not in the vaccine. And as we know, this is one of the ingredients that was linked towards autism, and all the studies have proved against that. And breastfed infants, as an interesting factoid, ingest 15 times more mercury than infants who are formula fed, so because it's in the breast milk. So again, it's something that we see in the environment, not just in vaccines. A couple other issues are the egg protein and antibiotics. Parents are worried that if they're allergic to egg protein, they can't have vaccines. If they're allergic to certain antibiotics, they can't have vaccines. Egg protein is present in influenza vaccine, but we are now recommending that even if you have a true egg allergy, you should still receive the flu vaccine. And there are actually many allergists who you can send, and I was reading about this in this article, that you can send the child to the allergist, and they'll actually do like 4 small doses of the flu vaccine, so they still get the flu vaccine, but it's just spread out in a controlled environment if parents are truly that worried. The antibiotics that are present in vaccines, they are used to prevent bacterial contamination. It's mostly neomycin, streptomycin, or polymyxin B, which are commonly found in Neosporin. And they rarely ever cause allergic reactions, so that's a very small risk. And some parents are worried about the MMR vaccine because it is made in chick embryos. But since it's the embryo cells and not the actual egg protein that they're using, there's no protein left, so it's a minimal risk. Gelatin, however, is in the MMR vaccine, so that is one of the contraindications that if you have severe gelatin allergy and anaphylaxis documented, you do not get any more MMR vaccines. It's used as a stabilizer in vaccines, so to keep vaccines suspended as they should be. And it comes from skin or hooves of pigs. Not everybody was aware of that. A lot of parents say, well, my religious group is against that, as certain Jewish people, Muslims, do not typically eat pigs or porcine products. But all of the religious groups have proven that this is fine. You can still vaccinate. What they said in the article was that vaccines are not ingested except for the rotavirus, which doesn't have gelatin in it. And so since the gelatin is highly purified and hydrolyzed, the benefits of the vaccines outweigh the risks. So all of the religious groups have approved it. There's a couple other little concerns that parents might bring up with you. Vaccines do not contain antifreeze. I didn't really know where that came from. I tried to look it up a little bit more. I thought it was an interesting factoid. There are sometimes used the Thimerosal, and again, we'll talk about that in a second. And vaccines no longer or do not contain fetal tissue. They never have. There is a use of human cell culture for some vaccines, and they're from 2 fetuses in the 1960s who were aborted for medical reasons. So they were not iatrogenic abortions. They were needed because the pregnancy was not viable. These particular cells have an indefinite lifespan, and there's no fetal tissue actually in the cells, so they're just using them over and over for the viruses that they need for the cells to grow. Next myth, the HPV vaccine will give my teenager a sexually transmitted disease. So this little poster here comes from Dr. Mercola, who is an osteopathic physician who also prescribes to alternative medicines. And he published this very long, very intense article about how the HPV vaccine has caused death and other injuries. That the article has now been negated, but I thought it was interesting when I literally just clicked on it because I thought it was an interesting poster, and then it gave me this whole article about why the poster was there. The CDC, however, gives us a nice happy poster, about how HPV vaccine prevents cancer and is recommended at now ages 11 or 12. And the AAP says about the HPV vaccine, we recommend before age 14 to prevent cancer and genital warts, and that it's very, very safe, and we'll talk about some of that here. There's been since the start of the HPV-2 vaccine, there have been over 170 million doses given, no serious safety concerns. Some teenagers get redness at the site or faint, so we do recommend that we keep the teenagers in office for 15 to 20 minutes, and that it's a partial virus vaccine, so it's got the killed virus in it. There's no way it can cause the actual illness. There's over 120 types of HPV. We currently are vaccinating now against 9 of the types. For the longest time, we had just the regular Gardasil, which was 4 types, 16, 18, 6, and 11. And now we have the Gardasil 9, which covers 5 more types. The Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report is where all this information comes from. Of course, we know the most common types that cause cancer are 16 and 18, and that what their number estimated, and this is from, I think, 2015, 19,200 women and 11,600 men have been diagnosed approximately yearly with a cancer caused by an HPV infection. 16 and 18, you're more likely going to see cervical, vaginal, and vulvar cancers in women, penile cancers in men, and you can see both oropharyngeal and anal cancers in women and men. And then even 6 and 11, which are the more benign types that we're initially vaccinated for, can cause benign or low-grade cervical abnormalities. 3 vaccines have been licensed, and it's been 11 years now since we've had Gardasil, the HPV vaccine. First was Cervarix, which was a bivalent, 16 and 18, and then Gardasil, in addition to the original 4, covers types 31, 33, 45, 52, and 58. There is aluminum as an adjuvant in the 9-valent, which was not previously included in the 4-valent, and it's only 500 nanograms of amorphous aluminum, which is a very, very small number. The only contraindication to the Gardasil 9 is an immediate yeast hypersensitivity, because there is yeast in the vaccine as well. From March 2015, this is when they were working on developing the new Gardasil shot, so the Gardasil 9. The efficacy of Gardasil 9 was reported at 96%, and 1 month after the vaccine for the 9-valent showed that almost everybody had converted for all 9 serotypes that they were vaccinated against. And this is a chart that shows those numbers. I apologize for the depth of the room. It might be hard to see in the back. But this is looking at specifically cervical intraepithelial neoplasias, grade 2 or higher. And it was 140,000 females they looked at for these numbers. And for those that received the 9-valent versus the 4-valent is what they looked at, and 96% efficacy for the 9-valent, so it's a very high number. And this chart looked at 2,400 females and males with the vaccine to 400 females without the vaccine, and showed that there's no difference between the two for seroconversion for the initial 4 types, 6, 11, 16, and 18. So the Gardasil is still a good vaccine, but they're taking it off the market because Gardasil 9 is now all that's available. So what that comes to the conclusion of, though, is that the HPV vaccine does not cause HPV. It causes very good immunity to it, though. The influenza vaccine causes the flu. I know I've heard it in the last several months. I'm sure everybody else has heard it in the last several months. Recently, in my continuity clinic, we heard this one, which was new to all of us, that the government puts trackers in the influenza vaccine. God love Dr. Gibson and I. We kept serious somehow. But she was 100% serious. I asked her what her concern was about the flu vaccine, because the child had got it the year before, and she said, well, I know you put trackers in the vaccines. And we told her, of course, that it does not put trackers in the vaccines, but we were both a little flabbergasted at that comment. So the AAP states that the vaccine should be given universally, either trivalent or quadrivalent. The trivalent has the 2 A's and 1 B. Quadrivalent has an initial B. Unfortunately, the H1N3, which is the flu going around this year, was not included in the vaccine, which is, I think, why we're seeing so many flu numbers right now. But I'm sure they'll adjust it for next year. We're no longer giving the flu mist, which was really hard for some of my older patients. And as I mentioned earlier, all children with an egg allergy should receive and can receive the vaccine. So the Influenza Incidence Surveillance Project, the IISP, is the biggest database for the rates and complications of flu. And the MMR puts out, or the MMWR puts out a yearly report about flu numbers. And the data right now goes through 2013. The highest rates of outpatient visits for flu positive were children aged 2 to 17 in the years from 2009 to 2013. There were, of course, positives in adults as well, but the highest rates were in children. Complications, ICU stays, hospitalizations were all in children, or children less than 5, especially less than 2, and adults greater than 65. There were, of course, complications in between those ages, but that's where the highest rates were. 2009 to 2013 estimated that in those years there was anywhere from about 100,000 to about 600,000 hospitalizations for influenza. And for children, of 100,000 hospitalizations, there were about 150 that were flu-related in a 15-year period, especially in the younger age. A little bit less for the older age, but that critical period of less than 1 is a high number. And in the 2009 pandemic season, which was just past the data that they collected, they noted 358 deaths in children less than 5 from flu. And influenza deaths for the years 2009 to 2013 ranged anywhere from just over 30 to almost 200. There have been many studies looking at the response of flu vaccine. Is it efficacy? Is it good? Should we give it? Everybody, adults and children, can mount both humoral and cell-mediated responses. Most children and adults have high titers after they receive the vaccine, except for, unfortunately, in the live attenuated, which is why we are no longer recommending. And the duration of immunity is typically 6 to 8 months. So if you get your vaccine in September, October, which is when we typically start recommending it, you should be covered through the whole flu season. What's interesting is that sometimes the efficacy can be longer. There was a pandemic in 1968, which was Hong Kong 68, and that vaccine actually had effectiveness for up to 3 years. That's not typical. They're not really sure why, is what the data said, but it was an interesting fact. There was a Landsat study based out of Sweden from 2010 that compared vaccinated to unvaccinated children just to see, is there a good response in children? And they looked at about 600 children altogether, most of who were not vaccinated, so only about 150 were vaccinated for flu. But of the numbers, 5% that were flu positive, or 5% that were vaccinated were flu positive, versus 13% that were not vaccinated were flu positive. So the effectiveness was about 2/3, which is comparable to the data from the AAP and the CDC. And they even looked at specifically a subgroup of little kids, so 2 and less, and they were very similar findings. It was 4% for vaccinated and 12% for not vaccinated. And they also mentioned at the very bottom of the article that in the 250 altogether, so the older kids and the younger kids that were vaccinated, there were no adverse events from the flu vaccines. So you can tell parents with the flu vaccine that they may see fever, malaise, myalgias after the vaccine, especially the first time that they are receiving the vaccine if they've never been exposed to the virus. It can last a couple days, and most frequently you're going to see fever and rash, on occasion febrile seizures and other longer complications. And the last myth, vaccines cause autism. So we all, I hope, know Dr. Andrew Wakefield, who wrote the paper in 1998 about the 8 children who developed autism after the MMR vaccine. Since that point, 10 of the 13 authors in the study have retracted the findings, and the Landsat also retracted the study based on ethical misconduct, the main vaccine in question that never contained Thimerosal, and how the rate of autism has continued to rise despite taking the Thimerosal out of all vaccines. Some flaws that were in this study: most of the children diagnosed with autism have recently received MMR. We give MMR at 12 months and at 4 years, and that's when we often diagnose autism. It claimed that autism was related to GI symptoms, that the IgA levels were low, but they didn't adjust the IgA levels for the age because there are different levels of normal for different ages. and that intestinal nodular hyperplasia, which is the GI finding they tried to link, is often a normal variant. There was then a second study a few years later that looked at specific biopsies from the children's GI system, and it didn't say whether it was a virus, like a virus actually contracted or a vaccine virus. It didn't match length of time for children between the vaccine and the biopsy, and the RT-PCR is very sensitive with a high false positive, so again, the numbers just weren't accurate. And this is the actual Landsat retraction statement. It took just over 12 years for them to actually retract it. Of interesting note, Dr. Wakefield, after he served his sentence in England, moved to Austin, Texas, has an underground following in Austin, Texas. He cannot practice medicine, but he does work with an autism center down there that is very much anti-vaccine, and he has produced this movie called Vaxxed, which is a documentary against vaccines. I was going to watch it, but it's very expensive to rent it, so I didn't watch it, and I felt like it would probably just be a waste of my time. So the Mmr vaccine, again, as mentioned, is the big one that Dr. Wakefield looked at. It was introduced in 1971, but the rise in autism incidence has occurred over the last 15 years. So there's been no change in or increase in the number of MMR vaccinations, but there is an increase in autism, so there's no correlation there. Several articles from Landsat and Vaccine have looked at over 3 million adverse events that have shown no connection to pervasive developmental disease, as well as just kind of continually confirming what we already know. There was an article in JAMA that looked at 15 years of California vaccination records that showed the exact same thing. No increase in the rate of MMR vaccine, but an increase in autism diagnosis. So again, just reiterating the data that's already there. The other big kind of preservative in question is the Thimerosal. There was a relatively recent study in Pediatrics that looked specifically at the link. It looked at about 1,000 children overall, almost 300 which had autism spectrum disorder, about 700 that didn't, matched them by birth year, who was taking care of them, how they were getting their vaccines, and showed no link between the Thimerosal exposure and then the increase in autism spectrum. So again, all of these numbers, all of these data prove against what Dr. Wakefield kind of created this crisis of. How should we talk with parents about vaccines? There's a 2009 study in Pediatrics that looked just at this. They sent out a very, very long questionnaire to parents about vaccines, what their thoughts were on vaccines, how they felt about vaccines, and almost 80% of them thought that vaccines were important to their child's health. I wish the number had been higher to that, but about the same number did show that the child's doctor or nurse was the most kind of important person in making their decision on vaccines. And the study concluded that a holistic approach was needed to address the parent's concern. So this first chart here is kind of the attitudes of what parents have. So it talks about, am I strongly neither agree nor disagree or disagreeing about whether I should vaccinate the child? Am I worried about vaccinating my youngest child? So parents that have already had one child vaccinated, and now they're going to vaccinate their second child, so on and so forth. And this next chart here shows, and it's hard to read, but these are the different concerns that parents have. So is there a serious disease they might get? Is it important to vaccinate to prevent spread of disease? In general, how safe do you think vaccines are for children? The last table, and there were more tables in this article, but the last table that I picked that I thought was interesting is that only 80% of parents felt that their healthcare provider had strongly recommended that they vaccinate their child, which, as we know, in pediatrics especially, and this looked at pediatricians, family practitioners, and then med-peds as well, we are really the front line for vaccinating these children and keeping the diseases out of the children. So I thought that was kind of sad how low that number was. The CDC recommends listening, maintaining eye contact, or restating concerns the parents may have, asking open-ended questions, such as, what can I help you understand? Having long conversations, acknowledging that the parents have worked hard and don't appear offended when they do ask you those questions. You know, I have concerns about vaccination. Balancing using science, all the data that I just presented you, versus using anecdotes, so talking about a patient who decided to vaccinate after X. Being open and honest about talking with the parents, but reminding them about the overall benefits compared to the risks of these vaccines. And then trying to reduce stress, reminding the parents crying is normal, it does hurt. Parents should be calm, trying to use a favorite toy to distract the child, giving mothers time to breastfeed or bottle feed afterwards. Research has shown that a presumptive approach is actually more effective than a participatory approach with parents. So presumptive being that you walk in or the nurse walks in and says, today your child is due for 2 vaccines, rather than saying, do you want to vaccinate your child with these 2 vaccines they're due for today? So just being a little bit of kind of an authoritative person rather than having a conversation and asking their opinion. The AAP specifically talks about the case example. So these are 4 points. Corroborate is acknowledging concerns, setting the tone for respectful, successful talking, and finding points you can agree on. Talking about what you've done in specific in your studies and research about vaccines. Describing what the science says. And then giving your advice to the patient or the parent, depending on how old the patient is, in the best way that you can. Unfortunately, though, as we all know, sometimes it doesn't work. So what do you do in that case? The AAP no longer recommends excluding children from the practice. They said that this puts them at more risk for other health problems because we can't follow their development if we don't see them. Ensuring that parents know what signs, symptoms to look for with diseases, but also explaining to them that if they're going to have a sick visit, we don't know, is it a normal cough, cold, or is it mumps or chicken pox? So you might have to have them come in through the back door or see them on a Saturday morning the next day before all the other patients come into the room, because you have to protect all the other patients that are choosing to vaccinate or have weakened immune systems and cannot vaccinate. They also recommend being persistent. So every visit, talking to these parents, presenting them more facts, asking them questions, keeping things open-ended, and then at every well-child check, having them sign a refusal to vaccinate form. And this is even for something as simple as the flu vaccine. You should have parents know that we are documenting that they're not doing it. Those are really what the AAP and the CDC agrees with this as to how to approach parents that have decided to refuse vaccines. So that's actually all that I have. Do I have any questions or concerns, comments? Faith.
Approach a parent that says, for the Hpv vaccine, that says, well, my kid's not going to have sexual intercourse until they're much, much older.
That is a very good topic. So there's a really nice HPV article, and it talks about that. One thing they do suggest is talking to the child by themselves. If they're old enough, 13 or above, ideally you can talk to them because you've got your HEDS questionnaires that you should be asking about. But also encouraging mother or father and parent and child interaction, having them be open with each other and not being judgmental towards whatever the child's decisions have been. 26 is where you can start it. So at 26 and 364 days, you can start the HPV cycle, and that would be the 3-shot cycle. But at 27, you cannot start it. They used to recommend that if you are already sexually active or have an HPV infection, you should not vaccinate. They don't recommend that anymore. So everybody gets vaccinated.
In one way, just a comment, and thank you for a wonderful, wonderful talk.
Thanks, Dr. J.
Close to my heart. But one way I approach that when parents say this is a sexually transmitted disease, I really don't think my kid's sexually active, they don't need it. I just turn around, look at them and say, that's really not a valid reason. It's the only vaccine that we know that prevents cancer. And if you think about it, we're starting to vaccinate them for a sexually transmitted disease at birth. The hepatitis B, is blood products. And we start with the Hep B at birth. Why would we not do the HPV much before they're ever ready to be sexually active, to prevent it? So that's one thing that I tell them. And usually people think about it and then that makes them sort of accepting of that.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Malkani?
Is the ETSU policy no vaccines in your out?
It is. Mm-hmm. I honestly don't know the reasoning behind that decision. I don't know if Dr. Toole or Dr. J could touch on that some. Dr. Aiken used to take patients that did not vaccinate, and then when he left, we kind of phased that out. So.
I think the AAP recommendation is more recent. Several of us who are fairly, committed to vaccinating, and it makes it hard to deal with a family that refuses your recommendations, because then that opens the door for refusal of other recommendations. But
Dr. Taylor.
Couple of observations and comments. I noticed a few people in here have a little silver in their hair, but not too many. I had measles, mumps, rubella, cough, chicken pox, flu one time, and
So did my parents. Yeah.
a lot of vaccines. And part of the problem with getting people vaccinated is they're more afraid of the vaccine than they are of the illness, since they don't see the
Right. I mean, how many of us resident-wise have ever seen chicken pox? I had it as a baby, but I've never seen it in a patient.
So as a result, when you talk to these people, you have to build a significant amount of trust, which is very hard. When you get to that point that they're not going to trust you no matter what, then you need to find someone they can see that they would trust. And that's kind of what it boils down to after long discussions I've had with numerous ones. So with the HPV vaccine, one of the comments I make to the parents is, okay, I know your child will never have sex till they get married. Okay? However, in this world that is very dangerous, there is no guarantee that something terrible will happen to your child that they can't control. And if you can protect them from something that might occur from that, wouldn't you want to do that? And then the mother sometimes look at me and say, I didn't think of it that way. That's not a bad idea. It is a dangerous world out there. So those are a couple of little things in my head.
Any other?
Way to kind of solve the problem, you could say, even though you're not going to have sex at this time, this is a good time to get immunization, so you prepare, because after the age of 26, you cannot have a shots anymore.
Right.
And I think you cannot have been exposed to those antigens. Once you have, then the vaccine doesn't protect.
Right. It would protect against the other types, but not the type they've been exposed. Right.
So you want to try and protect before there's ever a chance of having been exposed, which is why we chose that age.
Any other questions? Dr. Malkani?
What is the policy in Tennessee for school and immunization?
As far as I know, public schools don't have a policy, but they have a recommendation. Does anybody, I didn't look specifically into school policies in states.
I think they have a required vaccine list, and then
Okay.
you can get exemptions either for religious or medical reasons, but that has to be signed by a physician.
Right. And that's typical in most states. I know Missouri was the same way. I think California was the first state to mandate vaccines for public schools, so.
Are there any studies looking at herd immunity in areas where the rates of immunizations are lower?
That's why you're seeing mumps come back.
Yeah, as far as I know, there are studies. I didn't see any published, and I, of course, didn't talk about herd immunity. But the highest rates of non-vaccination right now are kind of out west and southwest. That's kind of where that whole population is situated. And that's kind of why we're seeing the mumps, measles in California. But we've had mumps and measles in Tennessee this year, so at Vanderbilt, right. So it's close to home as well. And it would be interesting to see those numbers. I didn't see any in my research, but I'm sure they're out there somewhere.
I know in an outpatient situations, coming from the pharmacy side of things, we have a lot of patients come in on antibiotics who are trying to get vaccines. I know you spoke about contraindications. I wanted to know your thoughts on vaccines while antibiotic therapy and steroids are being used.
As far as I understand, there are no contraindications to antibiotic use. So in that case, we have a source for the fever, we're treating the fever, we can give the vaccine. I forgot about outpatient pharmacies having flu vaccines or whatever, so tetanus, so.
She mentioned the steroid use, because I've read that if you're currently being treated with steroids, that you might have a lower efficacy and lower response to vaccines.
It's not something I saw in the research that was mentioned, but it would be interesting to look into that too, because it does affect your immune system, steroids. So, is it a recommendation to wait? Okay. 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 It's long-term steroids. Yeah, short-term is fine. So.
Considered immunosuppression, so if you're chronically immunosuppressed, then you would pay attention to all those sort of
Right.
immunosuppressed vaccines.
I believe for adults, it's 21 grams a day or higher, you're at risk, and then for the kids, it's a milligram per kilogram.
Okay. For a long term. Yeah.
Apply mostly to, and it would apply mostly to the Mmr chickenpox, rotavirus.
Right. The live viruses.
Virus vaccine.
Right.
I just have one last quick thought for our group. Considering the new hepatitis B recommendations and the fact that we can start immunizing premature infants, I don't know if there are any neonatologists left in the group.
I think Dr. Barty stepped out.
Are we going to start immunizing our premature babies so we don't get missed?
I don't know, but I am in the NICU next month. And Amy, do you have any thoughts on that?
So, it is now on our initial order sets, and so, well, it might be gone again, but it's supposed to be. And we are trying to get all the bigger babies. I don't know what they look like over 2 kilos, because we weren't doing anybody.
Right.
So we are starting to try to do at least 2 kilos.
Yeah. And the weight statement.
A little bit.
Well.
System of you transmitting that to the outpatients so that we know that they have had their vaccine.
System to transmit a lot of things.
And typically the little bitties are unstable anyway, so that's still the contraindication. But maybe the 30 weekers that are small, that number or that recommendation just came out February 6th, so it's only been out for like 2 weeks. So
Like, I can't see us like, 500-gram babies.
I can't see that either, but they're also intubated and on drips and lines, and so.
I would love if there's, some kind of QI piece that somebody's looking at for if you all vaccinate with the flu vaccine during a hospitalization, or if they're given the Hep B or like any vaccines, there's a good way that comes across in the records, because
Would be nice.
And usually we find out because the mom says, "Why are you vaccinating?" Because we got the flu already at the hospital.
Right.
And
And we don't get good transmission from here to there.
I mean, for us, it's just, there's a blurb and they're under healthcare immunizations, and you have to dig for it, so just search
And that's a 12-page document right there, so. Well, thank you for coming today. Thank you for listening about vaccines.